The night began like every other night of her private war. A woman alone in a luxury apartment, surrounded by the kind of silence that comes after too much screaming. Sarah Bennett sat on the bathroom floor, back pressed to the cold tiles, her reflection a stranger staring back from the mirror above the sink. Her lip was split again. The bruise blooming along her jaw looked like the ghost of a handprint, his. She touched it, not to heal it, but to remember why she had to leave. 3 years. That was how long she had been dying slowly behind perfect walls and expensive glass. 3 years of Marcus Whitmore's charm in public and cruelty in private. He had built her world, and then sealed every door shut. He chose her clothes, her friends, her words, even the way she smiled. And each time she tried to fight, he reminded her that no one would ever believe her. He was power wrapped in money and influence. She was the fragile little ornament he kept on display. Tonight, that illusion shattered. He had found the envelope. The one hidden behind the false panel in her dresser, the quiet rebellion she'd built coin by coin, paycheck by paycheck. Enough money to disappear. Enough hope to breathe again. When he stormed into the room, his eyes were wildfire, beautiful, bright, and merciless. He grabbed her wrist, and the pain snapped through her bones like lightning. He told her she wasn't going anywhere. That no one would ever take her away from him. That he'd destroy her before he let her go. And she believed him. The moment he slammed the door and left her sobbing on the floor, something inside her finally broke, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't weakness anymore. It was silence sharpening into resolve. Her heart was still beating. And as long as it did, she wasn't his. She cleaned the blood from her mouth and pressed her palm against the mirror, whispering to the woman on the other side, "This ends tonight." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The kind that made even fear listen. Outside, thunder rolled over the city skyline as she threw essentials into a duffel bag, wallet, phone, keys, the hidden envelope. The rain had started before she even reached her car. By the time the city lights blurred in her rearview mirror, her heartbeat had steadied into something dangerous. Freedom. The highway stretched ahead, empty and black, a ribbon leading her somewhere she didn't dare imagine. Somewhere he couldn't follow. The signs began to change, from streets to forest, from safe to forbidden. Her headlights cut through the storm, and for the first time in years, she breathed without counting his footsteps behind her. Shadow Pine Territory. The words glowed faintly on a rusted border sign, half buried under vines and rain. She'd heard the stories whispered by hunters, hikers, thrill-seekers. No one who crossed into those woods ever came back. The wolves ruled it. The Alpha King himself had drawn the borders in blood. Humans were trespassers, intruders to be hunted on sight. Maybe that's why she smiled through her tears. It was madness, yes. But madness still tasted better than captivity. She crossed the border. The forest greeted her like a living thing. The air thickened, heavy with mist and the scent of pine. Her car engine coughed once, twice, and died completely, leaving her in silence broken only by rain on metal. For a heartbeat, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel. Then she laughed, a sound cracked and desperate. Of course the car would die here. Of course fate would choose now to test her courage. She stepped out into the storm, shoes sinking into mud, wind tearing through her hair. Every branch seemed to whisper, every shadow to breathe. She walked until her flashlight flickered and died, until the forest swallowed even her own footsteps. The cold gnawed through her clothes, but she didn't stop. Her lungs burned, her body ached, but she didn't stop. Because every step forward was one farther from him. Every breath was proof she was still alive. Lightning flashed. For an instant, she thought she saw eyes in the dark. Too high, too steady to belong to any human. A low sound followed, deep and resonant, the kind of growl that made the ground hum. The stories had been right. They were real. Her body trembled, but she didn't turn back. If the wolves wanted her, they could have her. At least they wouldn't lie, wouldn't smile while cutting her down piece by piece. The forest seemed endless, ancient, aware. When her strength finally gave out, she fell to her knees in the mud, head bowed, whispering to the storm above, "If this is how I go, let it be fast." The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was a flash of golden light, eyes, bright and merciless, watching from between the trees. She didn't know it yet, but she had crossed more than a border that night. She had crossed into a destiny written long before her first scar. And the beast waiting in the shadows was about to learn that not all humans break when they bleed. The storm had turned the forest into a cathedral of shadows. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every branch bent low as if bowing to something ancient, something unseen. Sarah didn't know how long she had been walking. Time didn't exist anymore, only the rhythm of her heartbeat, the rasp of her breath, and the pounding of rain against her skin. Her hands were numb. Her feet had long since stopped feeling anything. But she couldn't stop. Stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering. She had crossed the border hours ago, though she wasn't sure exactly when. One moment, she had been following the broken road that curved between the trees. The next, her car had coughed its last breath, headlights flickering out like dying fireflies. The silence afterward had been deafening. It was the kind of silence that felt aware. The stories had always painted Shadowpine as something otherworldly, a realm where the laws of nature bent to the will of its ruler, the Alpha King. The first wolves had claimed it before humans had even built cities. Now, no human dared step across the invisible line carved into the earth by generations of blood and instinct. But desperation is stronger than fear. And Sarah Bennett had nothing left to lose. The forest felt endless. The trees stood so tall they seemed to pierce the clouds themselves, their trunks slick with moss and rain. Every now and then, she thought she saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast to be wind, too deliberate to be chance. Once, she swore she heard breathing that wasn't her own. Heavy. Slow. Predatory. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Her mind replayed Marcus's words, cruel, polished, confident. He had told her no one would ever believe her. That she'd die alone if she tried to leave. That he owned her. She had believed him once. But not anymore. Even if these woods devoured her, it would still be her choice. Her ending. A flash of lightning lit up the forest in silver light, and for the briefest heartbeat, she saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Golden, amber, red, gleaming like jewels in the dark. The rain muffled everything but the sound of her own pulse thundering in her ears. She stumbled backward, mud splashing up her legs. They were watching her. Not attacking, not yet. Just watching. The air shifted, charged, thick with the scent of earth, rain, and something else, something alive, primal, wild. The kind of energy that made her skin prickle and her instincts scream that she had trespassed somewhere she shouldn't have. For a moment, she thought about turning back. But where would she go? Back to the city? To Marcus? To the cage she'd barely escaped. She looked over her shoulder, only darkness waited behind her. There was no going back. She moved forward, deeper into the forest. Every step sank into the mud. Every breath burned. Her flashlight flickered once, then died completely, swallowed by the rain. Darkness consumed everything. Still, she kept moving. If she was going to die, she wanted to die walking. The terrain grew steeper, roots twisting up like claws from the ground. She slipped, fell hard, and hissed as pain tore through her knees. Blood mixed with mud, running down her legs. The metallic scent filled her nose, and the forest seemed to react. The whispering wind grew quieter. The shadows shifted closer. Something had noticed her. Something big. Sarah pushed herself up, hands shaking. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, the way the air grew heavier, charged with danger. And then she heard it. A low growl that rolled through the trees like thunder trapped in a chest. She froze. It was close, too close. The kind of sound that didn't belong to a creature that feared anything. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. She ran, branches whipping her face, the storm swallowing her screams. Behind her, the growls grew louder, overlapping, closing in. Not one. Many. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she didn't stop. Roots caught her ankles, rain blinded her, but still she ran. She tripped again, this time, she didn't rise. The ground vanished beneath her feet and she tumbled down a slope, rolling through mud and rocks until everything went still. Her body throbbed. Her vision spun. When she lifted her head, the world had gone silent. Completely. Even the rain seemed to pause. And that's when she saw them. A circle of wolves stood around her, massive and silent, their eyes glowing in the dark. Their fur glistened with rain, muscles shifting beneath as they moved. They weren't ordinary wolves, they were larger than any she'd ever imagined, their presence ancient and intelligent. They didn't snarl or attack. They just watched her, as though waiting for permission from something, or someone, greater. She turned her head slowly, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. And then she saw him. At first, she thought it was another wolf, larger, darker, stronger than the rest. But as lightning cracked across the sky, he straightened, rising on two legs. The others bowed their heads instantly. He stood tall, a silhouette carved from power and fury. The Alpha King. The monster every human whispered about. And she, Sarah Bennett, bruised, bleeding, human, had wandered straight into his dominion. For one heartbeat, the world stopped. His eyes found hers, molten amber burning through the rain. And in that single moment, she knew her life had ended one way or another. Either he would kill her, or he would never let her go. The storm calmed as if the forest itself bowed to him. He stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, still, and terrifyingly composed, while a dozen enormous wolves circled her like shadows given form. Their eyes gleamed gold, waiting. Listening. And at their center, Sarah lay in the mud, shivering, half-conscious, a single human heart hammering far too fast in a place that didn't forgive weakness. The Alpha King was nothing like the stories. He was worse. He wasn't a beast born of nightmares, he was something older, colder, and far too human in the cruelest way. Even in the rain, she could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her chest like gravity itself. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air itself trembled for him. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, molten amber bleeding into silver, the mark of a ruler, of pure dominance. Every muscle in his body moved with controlled violence, as though even stillness could kill. His dark hair clung to his jaw, framing a face carved from something both beautiful and merciless. She should have been afraid. She was. But somewhere beneath the terror, something else pulsed. Something dangerous. Fascination. When he finally moved, the wolves parted like mist before him. Each step was deliberate, heavy enough to make the ground shiver. He stopped a few feet from her and tilted his head slightly, studying the trembling, rain-soaked human sprawled in his territory. The silence between them stretched. The only sound was her breathing, sharp, uneven, desperate. He looked at her as if deciding whether she was worth the effort it would take to kill her. And still, she couldn't look away. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant, the world turned white. When the darkness returned, he was crouching beside her. Close enough for her to see the flecks of gold in his eyes, close enough to feel the heat of him through the cold air. He smelled of earth, smoke, and storm. A scent that didn't belong to any man she'd ever known. His gaze drifted over her, the torn clothes, the blood streaking her arm, the mud coating her skin. No pity. No softness. Just assessment, as if she were something that had wandered into his world by mistake. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. There was nothing she could say that would change her fate. She had crossed into the realm of a predator who ruled by fear and fire. And yet, for reasons she couldn't understand, she lifted her chin. If this was her end, she would at least face it standing. The movement drew his attention, his eyes flicked to her throat, where her pulse beat wild and frantic beneath her skin. For a moment, she thought he'd strike. But instead, he inhaled deeply, his expression shifting, confusion flashing in his eyes, as if something about her scent didn't make sense. It wasn't fear that stirred his wolf. It was something else. Then, as if realizing he'd hesitated, his eyes hardened again. He rose to his full height, towering over her. Rain dripped from his hair down his jaw, tracing the sharp lines of his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, low thunder wrapped in silk. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning behind them. You shouldn't be here. You don't belong. Her breath hitched. He took a step closer, and instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. The ground itself seemed to hold her still. It was madness, the kind that came from exhaustion, fear, and despair, the kind that made people jump from burning buildings rather than wait for flames. But in that madness, something inside her cracked open. She was done being afraid. Done begging. Done being powerless. And before reason could catch up to her, she did the unthinkable. She rose on shaking legs, reached out, and grabbed his shirt. Her fingers barely brushed his chest, but it was enough. Enough to draw 100 sharp inhales from the wolves surrounding them. Enough to make him still completely. And then, she kissed him. It wasn't a soft kiss. It wasn't gentle or pleading. It was desperate, wild, an act of rebellion from someone who had nothing left to lose. The rain poured harder, as though the heavens themselves wanted to wash the sin away. For one frozen heartbeat, he didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then, with a sound that was half snarl, half growl, he responded. His hand tangled in her hair, not tenderly, but with possession, dominance, fury. He kissed her back, and the world exploded. It wasn't human, what passed between them, it was primal, electric, wrong, and yet, it felt like recognition. Like she had stepped into fire and found warmth instead of pain. When he finally pulled away, his breath was rough, unsteady. His eyes, his eyes, blazed gold. Not anger. Not hunger. Something worse. Something faded. She stumbled backward, trembling, not from fear this time, but from the terrifying awareness that something ancient had just awakened. Something neither of them could undo. The wolves bowed their heads to him again, waiting for his command. But he said nothing. He just stared at her, breathing hard, jaw tight, rain dripping from his lips, the taste of her still on them. And in that moment, the Alpha King, who had vowed never to touch a human, realized he was already doomed. She woke to silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that waited, patient, watchful, and dangerous. The kind that hummed just before a storm. Soft sheets brushed her skin. They weren't hers. The air smelled of cedarwood and smoke, faintly spiced with something masculine and sharp, his scent. When her eyes fluttered open, she didn't see the forest anymore. She saw a room far too vast to belong to any human home. The ceiling arched high, carved from dark wood. Candles burned low along stone walls. Heavy drapes hid windows that seemed to whisper secrets of the night outside. Her wounds were gone. Every cut, every bruise, vanished. But the ache inside her ribs, that deep pulsing awareness, that remained. The memory of his lips, the weight of his hand in her hair, the heat of something forbidden and furious, still burned against her skin. She sat up too fast, the room tilting. And then she saw it, the door. Iron-banded, sealed tight, no handle on her side. She was trapped. For a moment she almost laughed, a broken sound. She had run from one prison straight into another. Except this one smelled of power, not fear. The sound of boots on stone froze her. Slow, measured, deliberate. Then the door opened. He filled the doorway like a shadow carved from midnight. The Alpha King. Gone was the wildness of the forest, the feral glow in his eyes. Here, in his domain, he was worse. Controlled. Calculated. A man who didn't need to raise his voice to command obedience. Power moved with him like smoke, invisible but suffocating. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Words felt useless against someone who could unmake her with a glance. He stopped near the bed, not close enough to touch, but close enough for the air between them to crackle. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then his gaze dropped to her throat, where her pulse fluttered violently beneath the skin. He could hear it. She knew he could. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made her wish he'd shout instead. "You're alive." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. She swallowed. "Should I thank you for that?" No answer. Just the slow tilt of his head, studying her like she was an equation that refused to balance. Her defiance interested him. She could see it in the small twitch at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to make her pulse stutter. He took another step closer, and her back met the headboard. The bed frame groaned softly beneath the tension. He smelled like rain on iron, something ancient, dangerous, intoxicating. When he spoke again, his tone was colder. "You crossed into my land. You touched me. Do you know what that means?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The truth was, she didn't. She only knew that she'd done the one thing she wasn't supposed to do. And now she belonged to the consequences. He leaned in just enough for his breath to brush her ear. "It means you live or die by my decision alone." A shiver chased down her spine, but still she whispered, "Then decide." His hand moved, too fast to see, too soft to stop. Fingers caught her chin, tilting her face upward until she was forced to meet his eyes. Gold burned there, faint but growing brighter. "You kissed me," he said, low and dangerous. "Do you even understand what that means to a wolf?" Her heart thundered. It meant survival. Something flickered in his expression. Pain? Amusement? Anger? She couldn't tell. Then he released her and turned away, pacing toward the window like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. For a long time, neither spoke. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Firelight flickered across his shoulders, painting shadows over muscle and scars she didn't have names for. Finally, he said, almost to himself, "You should be dead." "I've heard that before," she whispered. He turned then, and for the first time, she saw it, the crack in his armor. Just a flicker, gone as quickly as it came. But it was there. A question he didn't want to ask. A feeling he didn't want to name. When he stepped toward her again, something in his movements had changed. Slower. Heavier. Like gravity itself pulled him in her direction. "Why can't I kill you?" he murmured, more to the walls than to her. But the way his gaze locked on hers made her chest ache. She didn't have an answer. Maybe because fate had already decided for them. He stopped at the edge of the bed, close enough for her to see the faint silver scar across his collarbone, the mark of a battle long past. Close enough for her to feel the heat radiating off him like a furnace. Then, without another word, he turned away and walked out, the heavy door closing behind him with finality. The echo of his footsteps faded, but the echo of that question did not. Why couldn't he kill her? She sat in the candlelight, staring at the place where he had stood. Outside, thunder rolled again over Shadowpine, and deep in the heart of the forest, a wolf howled, long, low, and mournful. She didn't know it yet, but the sound wasn't for the trespasser who should have died. It was for the mate the Alpha King had just found. And for the fate neither of them could escape. The room had gone cold after he left, though the fire still burned. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, staring at the door that had swallowed him whole. The air still carried his scent, pine, smoke, power. She hated that it made her heart ache instead of tremble. Sleep refused her. Each time her eyes drifted shut, she saw him, the way his eyes had glowed when he'd asked, "Why can't I kill you?" The question haunted her as much as the answer frightened her. When morning bled through the curtains, she rose, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't bear to feel powerless anymore. The walls pressed too close, the silence too loud. She walked the perimeter of the room, tracing every inch, searching for weakness. But whoever designed this place knew how to hold a prisoner. The window wasn't barred like a cell, it was art, carved iron vines curling elegantly over thick glass. But when she pressed her hands against it, it didn't budge. Not even a whisper of give. So she turned her attention to the door. Solid oak. No handle on her side. For the first time, panic threatened to swallow her. Freedom had always been her reason for running. And now, it dangled just beyond the reach of her fingertips again. But she wasn't the same woman who'd cowered under Marcus's voice. Not anymore. She refused to let another man, even a king, break her into obedience. She began to test the boundaries quietly. The meals that arrived through a slot in the door, untouched. The luxurious gowns folded at the foot of her bed, ignored. If he wanted her to play the part of a captive doll, she would do the opposite. 3 days passed before the door opened again. He entered without warning. No announcement. No apology. The fire flared higher, as though the air itself bent to his will. He looked the same, tall, poised, the perfect image of control. But his eyes told another story. They were darker than before, rimmed with sleeplessness and something that looked dangerously close to obsession. She stood her ground. Barefoot, unbrushed hair, wearing the same linen shift she'd woken in that first night. If he wanted intimidation, she would meet him with defiance. He took her in with a slow sweep of his gaze. Then his voice, low and precise. "You haven't eaten." It wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in disappointment. She crossed her arms. "You said I live or die by your decision. So decide." For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then his jaw flexed, a tiny movement, but enough to shatter the illusion of calm. "You think this is rebellion," he said quietly. "It's not. It's suicide." "Maybe they're the same thing," she whispered. He moved before she saw it, a blur of motion, and suddenly his hand was braced against the wall beside her head. Not touching, not hurting, but close enough that she could feel the heat pouring off him. Do you want to die, human? His voice rumbled low, vibrating in her bones. She should have flinched. Should have trembled. But instead, she lifted her chin. I want to be free. Something in him cracked. Not visibly, not completely. But enough that his breathing changed. Freedom. The one thing he could never give and never have. For years, his life had been chains disguised as a crown, duty, vengeance, legacy. And now this human, this fragile trespasser, stood before him demanding the one thing he'd buried beneath years of control. He stepped back, every muscle in his body screaming restraint. You're not my prisoner, he said finally. You're alive because I allow it. Don't mistake that for mercy. She laughed, a soft, bitter sound. That's exactly what mercy sounds like. The sound unsettled him. He turned away, hands clenched behind his back. He wanted to end this, to end her, and yet, he couldn't. Every instinct screamed to protect what his logic told him to destroy. Eat, he said without looking at her. Rest. You'll need your strength. For what? He hesitated in the doorway, half shadow, half light. For the decision I haven't made yet. The door closed again, but the air didn't ease. It pulsed with something heavier now, something unspoken and alive. That night, when the moon climbed over Shadowpine, he stood on the balcony outside his chambers, staring at her tower window. His wolf prowled beneath his skin, restless and furious. She's ours, it whispered. She's human, he growled back. She's ours, the voice repeated, softer this time, almost mournful. And for the first time in a decade, the Alpha King's control began to slip. Down the hall, in her locked room, Sarah pressed her palm to the cold glass and felt the wind shift. Somewhere beyond the walls, she heard a low, distant howl, one that made her heart race without knowing why. Neither of them slept that night. He was learning the sound of her heartbeat in the silence. She was learning that monsters could look at you like they wanted to protect you, and destroy you in the same breath. The locked door had become more than wood and metal. It had become a heartbeat. A warning. A promise. The Alpha King's heart was no longer his own. And the human girl who kissed him would soon learn that freedom always came with a price. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, like the sky itself couldn't decide whether to weep or rage. The world outside her window was drenched in mist, the forest below whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. Sarah pressed her palm to the glass again, but this time the chill didn't bite, it called. Somewhere beyond the trees, she knew he was watching her. Kieran Ashenblade didn't need to see her to feel her. The bond wasn't visible, not yet, but it had begun to thread through the air like smoke, curling tighter with each passing day. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself it was control. But his wolf had stopped listening to reason the moment her lips touched his that night on the border. He hadn't gone to her since the last encounter. He'd kept his distance, burying himself in council matters, in border disputes, in anything that didn't wear the shape of her name. But even when surrounded by his advisors, his mind betrayed him, every voice faded beneath the echo of hers. By the fourth night, he gave in. The door to her chamber opened without warning, just as before. But this time, she was waiting for him. Not with defiance, with stillness. She sat near the fire, hair unbound, the light painting her skin in shades of gold and shadow. Neither spoke at first. The silence stretched, thin and taut, until it hummed between them. He moved closer. Not as a king. Not as her captor. But as something uncertain, something human. You're restless, she said quietly, not looking at him. His lips twitched, not quite a smile. And you've stopped pretending not to be afraid. I'm not pretending. That made him turn. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling where they rested in her lap. She didn't hide it. That honesty undid him more than any tears could have. You think I'll kill you. I think you don't know what you'll do, she said. And that's worse. For a moment, the truth hung there, raw and bleeding. Then he exhaled, a sound that carried the weight of too many buried memories. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. You shouldn't have kissed me. I know. Then why did you? She lifted her head and met his gaze. Because I wanted to feel alive before I died. That admission carved through him like silver. His control cracked. He moved before thought could stop him, closing the space between them in 2 strides. The air changed, charged, dangerous. She didn't retreat. She looked up at him like someone who had already made peace with the consequences. You think death would have freed you? He whispered. You think I would have let that happen? Her voice was barely a breath. You already have. Something inside him shattered completely then. All the walls, all the vows. He caught her wrist, but his grip wasn't cruel this time. It was desperate. His thumb brushed against the pulse beating wildly beneath her skin, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself. Because the monster he'd become was starving for the very thing he'd sworn to hate. He released her suddenly, stepping back as though burned. You don't belong here. You keep saying that, she said softly. But you haven't let me leave. Her words landed like claws against his chest. He turned away, pacing to the window, dragging a hand through his hair. The moonlight caught on his bare forearms, muscles coiled with restraint. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. You have no idea what I am, Sarah. I know enough. He faced her again, eyes burning gold. No. You see the man. But there's a beast inside me that doesn't care about mercy. It only knows hunger. Territory. Power. It kills without hesitation. That's what I am. And yet, she whispered, you haven't killed me. The silence that followed was thunderous. He stared at her like she'd reached inside his ribcage and touched something that shouldn't exist anymore. Something that still beat. She stood then, crossing the room slowly, each step measured. When she stopped in front of him, her voice was steady. You want to hate me. I can see it. But what if the only reason you can't is because you already did, and it broke you? The words hit him like truth from the moon goddess herself. He didn't touch her. Couldn't. Every instinct screamed that if he did, he'd never let go again. His wolf pressed against the edges of his control, whispering one word over and over, mate. He closed his eyes, forcing air into his lungs, fighting the bond clawing at his sanity. You have no idea what you've done to me. I didn't do anything, she said quietly. You're the one who's fighting something that doesn't want to be fought. He opened his eyes. For the first time, she didn't see the Alpha King. She saw a man, terrified, furious, lost. He turned toward the door but paused with his hand on the frame. His voice came low, almost broken. You should hate me, Sarah. It would be easier for both of us if you did. Then he was gone. The door shut, but this time it wasn't a barrier. It was an echo. That night, Sarah didn't cry. She stood at the window long after the fires went out, watching the mist roll through the forest. Somewhere in that darkness, she could feel his heartbeat, wild, heavy, untamed. And for reasons she couldn't explain, her own heart began to answer it. The Alpha King had spent 10 years building walls out of hate. And now, a single human kiss was tearing every one of them down. The moon hung low that night, heavy with secrets it wasn't meant to keep. The manor slept, but one soul within its stone walls hadn't known rest in days. Kieran Ashenblade stood in the solitude of his chambers, the shadows cast by the firelight shifting like restless ghosts. Every breath he took scraped against something raw and unhealed inside him. He'd spent a decade mastering silence, building a kingdom where emotion was weakness and mercy was death. But the human girl had cracked the foundation with a single look, a single act of defiance beneath the bleeding moon. Since that night, she had lived in his head like an echo that wouldn't fade. Her scent clung to him, maddening and sweet, a haunting reminder of what he could never have. He'd told himself she was a trespasser, an intruder, a threat to his authority. But deep down, he knew the truth. He kept her locked in that room not for her safety, not for the law, but because the idea of her leaving made something in his chest twist until it hurt to breathe. He had been cruel once, a creature molded by blood and loss. When his parents were murdered by humans, something inside him died too. Love, warmth, compassion, all burned away in the fire of that night. He had sworn then that no human would ever set foot in his heart again. Yet here he was, standing in his own weakness, haunted by a human woman's eyes. The bond was there. He could feel it pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath his skin, quiet, steady, unyielding. His wolf stirred restlessly, pacing in the depths of his mind. It didn't understand hatred or logic. It only understood truth. And the truth was that she belonged to him in a way no law or vow could undo. He pressed his palms against the edge of the table, veins standing out beneath the strain. The firelight flickered across his face, painting him in gold and red, a god and a demon both. Outside, the forest sang softly, the hum of night creatures, the rhythm of wind through ancient trees. He could almost hear her heartbeat in that rhythm, fragile but stubborn, like she refused to be erased by the darkness she'd stepped into. And maybe that was what unsettled him most. She wasn't fearless, she was terrified. But she still stood tall. Still looked at him without submission. Still dared to speak truths no one else would. He'd ruled for years with unchallenged dominance, yet a single human woman made him question who he was. He'd told her to hate him. Told her it would be easier. But deep inside, the thought of her hating him felt worse than the thought of losing control. Hate meant distance. Hate meant indifference. He could live with fear, anger, even rebellion, but not indifference. Not from her. The wolf growled in the back of his mind, low and possessive. Mate. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if the darkness could drown it out. No, he thought, but the word had no weight anymore. His body already knew what his mind refused to admit. Every time she breathed, every time her pulse quickened in his presence, he felt it, a pull, ancient and divine, older than the hatred he'd built his life upon. He remembered the moment she'd kissed him. The taste of blood and fear, the heat of her lips trembling against his. It had been madness. A plea. A challenge. And for that one heartbeat when her mouth met his, the world had gone silent. There had been no pain, no past, no throne. Only her. Only the forbidden softness he'd long forgotten how to crave. He should have killed her that night. It would have been easier. Clean. But instead, he'd touched her like a man remembering what it felt like to be alive. And now he was paying for it. Kieran turned from the fire, his reflection catching faintly in the dark windowpane, amber eyes glowing faintly back at him, wild and uncertain. He looked like a stranger. Not a king. Not a monster. Just a man standing at war with himself. In the quiet, he could feel her presence in the east wing, her heartbeat, faint but clear. It called to him, steady as the moon's pull on the tide. And the worst part was that it soothed him. He could no longer tell where his power ended and her existence began. He clenched his fists. You are my undoing, he thought, though the words were more confession than curse. Somewhere, miles away in her locked room, Sarah stirred in her sleep, unaware of the storm she'd set loose. The bond whispered between them, fragile but unbreakable. A thread of moonlight connecting two broken souls who had no right to find each other. The Alpha King sank to his knees beside the dying fire, his breath shaking for the first time in years. The moon watched from above, silent witness to a truth he could no longer deny. The beast inside him was no longer hungry for blood. It was hungry for her. And for the first time since the night his world had burned, Kieran Ashenblade, the most feared alpha in the realm, realized he was terrified. Not of death. Not of weakness. But of what he was becoming. Because he wasn't sure if he was falling in love with her. Or if she was dragging him back into the light he'd sworn to destroy. The peace in Shadowpine was deceptive. The kind that comes right before a storm tears the world apart. The forest, usually alive with whispers of wolves and wind, seemed to hold its breath. Even the air had changed. Too still. Too heavy. Sarah felt it before anyone said a word. The energy in the manor had shifted, the guards more alert, the corridors quieter, the conversations clipped and cautious. She'd learned to read moods in silence. Years with Marcus had trained her to sense danger before it arrived. But this was different. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Something, or someone, was coming. She stood near the window again, watching the fog settle across the treetops like a warning. The moonlight traced a path through the mist, pale and haunting, and for the first time in weeks, she felt that old chill return, the one that whispered her past was catching up. Far across the territory, the Alpha King stood on the northern balcony, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The reports had reached him at dawn, a scent near the border that didn't belong, a trail of unfamiliar boots, and whispers among the scouts about humans lingering too close to Shadowpine. He'd known this day would come. Kieran had spent years preparing for wars, rebellions, coups, but nothing prepared him for the fury that tore through him at the thought of someone coming for her. His wolf stirred, restless, pacing just beneath his skin. The mate bond had awakened something primal, something that refused to let danger go unanswered. The beta, Declan, had already confirmed what Kieran suspected. The human responsible for Sarah's pain had been asking questions. A man named Marcus Whitmore. Rich. Influential. Arrogant enough to think he could threaten an Alpha King's domain and survive it. Kieran didn't know if it was love or madness that made him feel what he felt. All he knew was that if Marcus crossed that border, the forest would drink his blood. But Sarah didn't know yet. Not the full truth. She only felt the distance. Kieran withdrawing again, his silences longer, his temper sharper. The bond between them hummed like a wire stretched too tight. It carried fragments of his emotions, flashes of rage, fear, and something darker she couldn't name. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The walls of her room felt closer somehow, pressing in on her like the past itself. She walked to the fire, letting its glow touch her skin, chasing away the cold creeping through her bones. But it wasn't the cold of weather, it was memory. Marcus's voice, like poison in her veins. The threats. The bruises. The false apologies. The way he'd smile in public, charming everyone, while whispering cruelty in her ear when no one was watching. She'd run to escape him. She'd thought crossing into the werewolf lands meant freedom. But freedom, it seemed, had followed her here, fragile, fleeting, and always shadowed by the past. And somewhere deep in the forest, that past was moving closer. The first scout found the tracks at dawn, tire marks half buried in mud, human footprints leading toward the ridge. The border patrols doubled. The alarms were silent but constant, wolves communicating through scent and sound. Every creature in Shadowpine knew trespassers were near. By midday, the scent trail had a name. Marcus Whitmore. The moment Kieran heard it, something inside him snapped. The reports came in one by one, but he barely heard them. The words blurred together: council interference, human envoys, political fallout. None of it mattered. All he saw was Sarah's face the night she arrived, broken, bloodied, afraid. He remembered her whisper, "If I'm going to die, I'd rather it be from you." And the thought of that man laying a hand on her again was enough to turn his vision gold. The fire inside him roared awake. But beneath the fury, there was something quieter, a fear he didn't recognize. He'd always been the hunter. Always the predator. Yet now, with her, he knew what it meant to have something to lose. The beast inside him didn't want vengeance. It wanted protection. Sarah felt the surge before he reached her room. The bond pulsed, a rush of emotion so strong it made her knees weak. Anger. Fear. Possession. The kind of intensity that didn't come from reason but from instinct. When he entered, she didn't need to ask what was wrong. She could see it in his eyes, that wild, glowing gold that meant the wolf was close to the surface. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. He stood there for a long moment, the storm of his emotions barely contained, then turned and left without a word. She didn't follow. She knew better than to chase a storm. But when the door closed behind him, she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat racing with his. The bond was louder now, stronger, almost alive. It pulsed with warning. Somewhere beyond the borders of Shadowpine, Marcus was coming, bringing his greed, his arrogance, and the chaos of the human world with him. And Kieran Ashenblade, Alpha King of the Shadowpine, was ready to meet him with teeth and blood. The forest would soon remember what it meant to anger an alpha with something to protect. Because this time, he wasn't defending a throne. He was defending his mate. By the next morning, the silence in Shadowpine wasn't peace anymore, it was pressure. The kind that settles over a kingdom right before the gods decide to break it. The pack had stopped pretending not to notice. Guards shifted restlessly at their posts, warriors whispered about the scent of human on the northern wind, and in the manor, every heartbeat seemed to wait for the Alpha's command. But the Alpha wasn't in his throne room. Kieran stood alone in the council chamber, staring at the parchment spread across the table. The seal was unmistakable, the supernatural council's crest burned into wax, carrying the weight of every law that had bound their kind since the end of the Great War. He didn't need to open it to know what it said. He'd already heard the messengers. The council was sending a delegation. And they were coming for her. Sarah. The human woman who wasn't supposed to exist within his borders. The human woman who had become the only thing that made his world make sense. He clenched his fists, the parchment crumpling in his grip. The council wanted to question him, to review the circumstances of the trespass, as if this were politics, not destiny. As if they understood what it meant to feel the bond burning beneath his skin every time she breathed. But there was more. Behind the council's words, he could smell another scent, arrogance and deceit. Marcus Whitmore. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. That man had gone to the council, twisting truth into poison. He'd called Sarah unwell, fragile, his. Claimed she needed to be returned to the human world for treatment. And the council, blinded by their need for peace with humanity, had listened. Fools. All of them. They didn't know what she'd escaped. They didn't know what he'd seen in her eyes the night she crossed into his forest. They didn't know she wasn't just human anymore. She was his. When Sarah woke that morning, the air felt different. Heavy. She could feel his unrest through the bond, the tension curling like smoke through her veins. She didn't understand it completely, but it frightened her, not because she feared him, but because she feared what could make a creature like Kieran afraid. The knock came not long after. Declan entered quietly, his expression tight. He wasn't the type to flinch easily, but his posture carried something she hadn't seen before, unease. And that was when she knew. Something was coming for her. The news spread faster than wildfire. By midday, the entire pack was talking, not openly, but in low murmurs that carried down every hallway. A council delegation. Human interference. The possibility that the Alpha might have to surrender the woman he'd been keeping in the East Wing. Sarah tried to keep calm, but her body betrayed her. Her hands trembled as she held her cup, her breath uneven as fragments of memory flashed. Marcus's grip, his smile, his voice promising she'd never escape him. No. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't. That evening, when Kieran finally appeared, he looked different. Not wild this time. Controlled. Too controlled. The kind of stillness that came before something broke. He didn't speak for a long while. The fire crackled between them, the sound sharp in the heavy silence. Then, softly, almost like a confession, he told her. The council was coming. Her ex had demanded her return. And if he refused, it could start a war. The words sank into her like stones. The room felt smaller, colder. Every part of her that had begun to heal fractured again. He watched her reaction closely, the way her shoulders trembled, the way her heartbeat faltered. Through the bond, he could feel her fear, could taste it like iron in his mouth. But it wasn't fear of him. It was fear of being taken from him. And that realization destroyed whatever restraint he had left. He moved closer, the firelight catching on the sharp line of his jaw, the golden glint in his eyes flickering like a promise. His voice, when it came, was low, barely human. There was only one way to stop the council. Only one law strong enough to defy them. If she became pack. The thought struck her like lightning. To be claimed by him, the Alpha King who ruled with blood and command, it wasn't freedom. It was binding. Permanent. Eternal. But freedom meant nothing if it meant going back to Marcus. She stood in silence, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. A human life, fragile and uncertain. Or the mate bond, terrifying and consuming. When she looked at Kieran again, her decision was already there in her eyes. She wasn't choosing power or protection. She was choosing him. Not because she was desperate, but because something inside her had already chosen long ago, the night she kissed him under the bleeding moon. Kieran didn't smile. Didn't speak. But the way his shoulders eased, the way his breath shook once, said everything. The bond pulsed between them, alive and ready. Outside, the wolves began to howl, a sound that rolled through the forest like thunder. The pack was gathering. The moon was rising. And fate was waiting. Tomorrow night, the claiming would begin. The moon rose early that night, vast, swollen, silver like the edge of a blade. It hung over Shadowpine like an omen, or maybe a witness. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the wolves went quiet, their usual howls replaced by a reverent, uneasy silence. In the heart of the territory, the pack gathered. Hundreds of them, filling the ancient clearing where the rituals of power had been carved into stone generations ago. The scent of pine, smoke, and moonlight filled the air. The Alpha King stood at the center, waiting. Kieran didn't wear a crown tonight. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence was crown enough. His eyes burned gold beneath the moonlight, his expression carved from stone, power restrained, hunger buried, destiny sealed. But beneath that calm, his wolf paced restlessly, howling inside his chest, demanding what it had been denied for too long. And when she appeared, when Sarah stepped into the clearing, even the wind seemed to stop moving. She wore white. Not pure white, but soft ivory that caught the silver light of the moon and made her look almost ethereal. Her hair was loose, brushing her shoulders, trembling slightly in the cool air. She looked fragile, human, out of place among the predators who surrounded her. Yet somehow, she didn't seem small. She walked like someone who had survived too much to ever bow again. Each step she took was a defiance. Each breath was a promise. The pack whispered as she passed. Some in awe. Some in disgust. Others in confusion, the human who'd bewitched their alpha king, the woman who should have been dead but was now about to stand at his side. But Sarah heard none of it. She kept her eyes on Kieran. On the only thing in this strange, violent world that made sense anymore. He met her halfway, the moonlight catching the faint scar at his temple, the mark of a battle long past. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire clearing, deep and certain. Do you know what you're asking for, human? She didn't flinch. Her throat tightened, but her voice didn't break. I'm not asking. I'm choosing. A flicker of something broke across his face, not quite a smile, but close enough to break the mask he wore. For a moment, the king disappeared, and only the man remained, the one who'd watched her bleed in his forest and chosen not to let her die. He reached for her hand. His touch was warm, rough from years of battle. It should have frightened her. It didn't. It grounded her. The wolves began to circle, forming the sacred boundary around the ritual. Declan stood at the edge, solemn, ready to bear witness. The old healer, Alara, stepped forward, her voice low and ancient as she began the invocation. Words in a language older than blood filled the air, vibrating through bone and spirit alike. The bond demanded one thing, consent. The alpha's mark could only be given if the other accepted it fully. When the time came, Kieran turned to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Once this is done, there is no undoing it. You'll feel me in every breath. You'll carry my scent, my power, my protection. You'll be bound to me in life and death. Do you still choose this? Sarah met his gaze. Her pulse thundered, fear mixing with something deeper, trust. I do. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his body unraveling in one silent tremor. Then he moved, slow, deliberate, reverent. His hand rose to her face, fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck. When he spoke again, his words were more vow than threat. Then you are mine. Not my possession. My equal. My Luna. And then he bit her. Pain flared. Sharp, searing, bright. Her knees buckled, but he held her upright, one arm around her waist as the heat spread through her veins. It wasn't just physical, it was elemental. Fire and electricity tangled together, burning through every memory of fear, every scar, every piece of the past that had ever told her she was powerless. Her heart stuttered, then steadied, a new rhythm, echoing his. The pack watched as the mark took shape, a silver crescent blooming against her skin where his teeth had pierced it. For a moment, she thought she saw the moon itself bend lower, watching. Kieran's eyes shifted fully wolf, gold blazing into molten light. When he spoke, the sound wasn't quite human. Mine. And somewhere deep inside her, something answered. Not with words. With power. Because in that instant, the bond didn't just connect them, it ignited them. The air cracked around them, the earth itself responding to the union. Wolves dropped to their knees, overcome by the surge of energy that rolled through the clearing. When it was over, the world was still again, but nothing was the same. Kieran pulled back, his lips stained with her blood, his chest rising hard and uneven. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not the trespasser, not the fragile human. His equal. His Luna. She met his gaze, the pain fading into warmth. So, what happens now? His jaw flexed once. Now, he murmured, voice rough and raw, the world learns you're untouchable. And as the howls of his pack rose to the heavens, echoing through the forest, Sarah realized she was no longer running. No longer hiding. For the first time in her life, she had been claimed, not as property, but as something sacred. As someone who finally belonged.